Well, welcome to our guests and our speakers and the APF team. To our guests, I'm Shamaila Chaudhry. I'm the president of the American Pakistan Foundation. I am so thrilled to be having this conversation today. This report is the culmination of several months of research, weekly meetings, several meetings a week, emails, conversations with the team of research fellows that works with APF. And some background on that is this past year, we started a research fellows program, which is intended to introduce research concepts and methodologies to future leaders, but who are interested in doing specific work on South Asia or Pakistan or things that are relevant to the Pakistani American community. And so we have the wonderful group of fellows that did this with us. Let me just quickly introduce them. We have Faraz Ansari, who's a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Jonathan Pearl, who is my assistant at APF, and he's our research coordinator as well, and Nainika Paul, who's doing her PhD at Rutgers. And then we have two of our fellows who weren't able to make it today. Jason Grill is a student at Duke University, and Zoya Sathar is a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS as well. So this report wouldn't have happened with any of them. So you are all amazing, and what a wonderful team to work with. It was such a pleasure for me. And so for today, what we'll do is we'll go through and present the findings of the report. And then we also are joined by some special guests. We have our good friend Kalsoom Lakhani, who's a founder herself and does a lot of work in Pakistan. She guided us quite a bit as we did this report and was an inspiration. And so we'll look to her for some reactions. And Ali Syed, who's also an entrepreneur based out of Texas in Houston, will provide some comments. And Shazia Khan hasn't joined yet, but she's the founder of Eco Energy, which does solar grid development in Pakistan. She'll be joining as well. So with that, why don't we get started? Okay, so I've been wanting to do a report like this for a long time. In my background is in U.S. foreign policy. I worked quite a bit on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and at various points in my career and in the careers of others who worked on this relationship, this question of the diaspora being impactful in Pakistan came up all the time. But I shouldn't even say it was a question. It was really an assumption that, oh, the diaspora can be really impactful, and why don't you do more, right? A really simple kind of assumption, and which, if you don't think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Like, yeah, well, all diasporas are involved in the development of their ancestral homes to a certain extent. But I felt like there never really was enough substantive research kind of undergirding these assumptions. And so I thought, given my role at APF and the mission of APF, that we should ask this question. Do the conditions exist for the Pakistani American community to positively impact socioeconomic development in Pakistan? And so as we started doing this research, we found that there was actually not a lot of information. There are not a lot of primary data or research on Pakistani Americans. And so that was kind of our first challenge, but we also saw it as an opportunity. It meant that we, given our access and our audience at APF, we could do some really interesting primary research. And so in order to respond to these assumptions, and just to give you a sense of our network at APF, for those who don't know, actually, folks, sorry, I meant to say, if you have questions, just submit them through the chat, and we'll take them as we go. As I was saying, the motivation was basically to respond to the assumptions that governments had mostly, and to remedy the shortage of primary data. But we also hope that this will create all this new research in the future. There's a lot of data here that we weren't able to explore. We also did our best to not make specific assumptions and fill in gaps where there were about like attitudes and like why Pakistani Americans feel this way about X, because more work needs to be done on that, more qualitative work. And on the left here, I just have an example from our timeline in the report. I encourage all of you to look at it. We did a little bit of research just tracking the evolution of legislation in the United States on immigration and mapping that alongside the arrival of the Pakistani community in the United States. And so there's a very rich history there. And I encourage all of you to look into that. And I should add also that, while we didn't find a lot of data and research on Pakistani Americans, there's some really good, solid sociological and anthropological work that's being done on this community by academics for a long time. And so we've included that in our literature review as well. Okay. So we had three areas of focus for the research. One was to look at the community's connectivity to Pakistan. And we'll talk about how we define connectivity. And two was to focus on the causes and issues to which Pakistani Americans give. Now, this is important because so much of the assumptions that are built around the community's impact are just not focused. They're like all over the place. Like, well, you can make the economy better. You can help poor people. You can put kids in school. And there's really no kind of guided vision to these assumptions. And so we wanted to understand, what do people already give to and what do they care about? And then third, related to that, what are the concerns and obstacles related to giving back to Pakistan? That's a really interesting part of the report. And there were some things there that surprised us. We'll get into those. And then additionally, our audience for this report. A good research project, a good research question always has to have a clear audience. And for us, we wanted to reach out to individuals and organizations who want to understand how the Pakistani American community can be impactful and positively shape socioeconomic development in Pakistan. So that's really the link of the assumptions are all really based on how can this outside community that's still connected improve socioeconomic conditions. Of course, there's like a private sector component to that. There's an education component to that, but in general, it's built around this concept of socioeconomic uplift, which I think is really important, given that the community is very motivated by charitable giving and values, which we'll get into as well. But this audience can include, but it's not limited to, policymakers, business, NGO, nonprofits, community, and philanthropy. So even with these different audiences, you could take this report and build it and expand and have like one just focused on philanthropy or business or the nonprofit community. So I'm going to turn it over to John now, who's going to talk about research methodology and the demographics of the folks that actually responded. So John, go ahead.
Thanks, Shamila. So I won't spend too much time on the mechanics. I know that, for some of you, this might be very interesting and for others, not so much, but we did just want to touch on how we collected the data that we're about to present. So over the course of several months, we came up with a 22-question survey. We distributed it via snowball sampling. So essentially, we recruited some participants and then asked them to send it to, other people of Pakistani American heritage, and they just, kind of go from there in like a chain email fashion. It's very hard to, do demographic research like this in a way that's, statistically, well powered and really representative. So it was, the best we could do, and I think it's fairly standard for this type of research. And so we actually got quite an excellent sample. So we got nearly 500 responses, 498 people, and those are the ones who filled it out completely. Others were, incomplete, but 498 really good responses, which was great. What I thought was very interesting was we got 38 different states. So you can see here, no one state accounted for more than 15% of the sample. So really cool geographic diversity, both showing, where the community is located, and also I think good evidence that this really does represent the view of a fairly national, broad spectrum group of folks, because there's really no regional bias here. A little bit of a gender bias towards men, 58%. The age range was about what you'd expect. So the modal age range, the most common age group for people to come from, was between 36 and 50. Though we actually did get quite a number of responses, ranging from 18, which was the youngest we allowed, all the way up. So we have quite a bit of age diversity, and we'll talk about some of the impact that age had on the various questions that have a lot of interesting implications later. And as you see here, 80% Sindhi or Punjabi origin, which, given the nature of the community that came over the past couple decades, that's roughly what we would have expected. So yeah, happy to take any questions at the end on, how we sampled, or, any of the backroom stuff, but certainly not the most important part here. Thanks.
Thank you, John. But that being said, developing a solid methodology and having a team that knows how to do designing surveys and data collection was really helpful, especially given my background as an English major in American literature in undergrad. I'm very thankful. I just want to quickly comment on this ethnicity. That bothers me, but because it's such a large number. However, I think if we dig into it, which we will in future research, if we dig into it, we'll find that, like John said, people came from certain parts of the country that might have been more privileged than others. And those are obviously concentrated in places around Karachi and Lahore, which are in Sindh and Punjab. And then most of the population is in those areas as well. However, I wonder how much it has evolved in the kind of after the 1990s, say. So there's a lot of interesting kind of further exploration to do there. All right, great. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so go ahead, Nainika.
Sure. So like Shamila talked about connectivity earlier, considering that the American Pakistan's Foundation mission statement is to build bridges between the US and Pakistan, we were interested in creating a better understanding for ourselves and for others of the Pakistani American community's connectivity with and attitudes towards Pakistan. So namely, in conducting our survey, we wanted to find out, number one, do Pakistani Americans feel the need to connect back to Pakistan, and at what rate? And number two, if there's a sizable population that chooses to connect back, how do they connect? So we found two interesting survey results, which you can see there on the slide. Number one being that over 75% of survey respondents expressed that they feel able to stay connected to Pakistan. And number two, 43% of the survey participants traveled to Pakistan within the past year, and another 40% traveled within the past 5 years. Of course, this was in slightly the early stages of COVID, but still, I think it's an important survey result. So the data does show that Pakistani Americans have high rates of connectivity to staying in touch with family and friends living there. Given the frequency of travel and communication platforms providing ample opportunities to maintain connectivity, it doesn't really seem surprising that over 75% of participants noted that they felt able to stay connected. And in terms of physical travel, there was, of course, as I mentioned with that statistic, a sizable population that continues to travel back to Pakistan, which roughly also tracks with the overwhelming percentage who indicate that they still have family there. So overall, it is consistent with historical patterns of Pakistani immigration to America, most of which has occurred in the last few decades. But in determining how people connect, whereas in prior decades, obviously from the 60s to 90s, mail and then email was the main form of communication, we see now that when given a choice of options from our survey results, WhatsApp seemed to dominate. Even when providing an open response section, most indicated, 38% indicated that they use WhatsApp as their main form of communication. Then just general I guess, mobile phone communication, 23% obviously Facebook, 10% Instagram, and then there's still 2% who choose to use postal mail. So, of course, aside from creating and sustaining personal connections, which these social media platforms are usually known for, we wanted to understand also whether Pakistani Americans are interested generally in the political, economic, and social affairs of the country. Again, we found the answer to be yes, but the quantitative response we received was in how Pakistani Americans chose to consume updates on affairs of the country, which was 25% actually chose to divert directly to Pakistani media, 24% get their news updates from WhatsApp, 21% from non-Pakistani media, 18% from Facebook, and 10% from Instagram, which is a pretty sizable statistic. But I would say that especially the 25% of Pakistani media is a testament to the digital age that we live in. So I'll end by saying this, which is, of course, in establishing a narrative about Pakistani Americans, we know the importance of creating a forward-looking picture. So there are, of course, many different variables when it comes to how and why people to choose to stay connected to Pakistan. So factors that can affect connectivity in the future can include number one, the number of family members who continue to live in Pakistan, which our survey respondents in some open answers made aware was the largest driver in them choosing to stay connected to the country. Number two, the ease and cost of international travel. And three, especially now during COVID times, perceptions of personal safety. So those were our main findings.
Wonderful. Thank you. This is so interesting. Just the media sources one. When we'll talk about this later, but it makes me think of themes of like disinformation, misinformation, kind of sourcing. There's so much there to elaborate on. Okay, Faraz, let's go over to you to talk about giving.
Sure. So as Shamila said, I think going into this project, we all had a lot of assumptions about where we thought the Pakistani diaspora was at and, what kind of behaviors we would see and find in our surveys. So for starters, as Shamila mentioned, there wasn't a lot of quantitative research done on the Pakistani diaspora, but there was some sort of like long range qualitative analysis done about like what are the motivations for why we're a giving community and that kind of stuff. And I'm happy that we sort of, our survey supported what was already existed, but also took that a little bit further. So for starters, there's a lot of literature and a lot of research supporting the idea that those diasporas with strong Muslim populations, they have strong zakat obligations, and that is linked causally to reducing poverty in the home countries. So we found that as part of our survey to be a strong motivation for why our community gave. And then a second thing, and I know that this is something that I can support anecdotally in my experience with the Pakistani community, is that especially in the older generations, a lot of people have a paying it forward mindset towards giving back towards Pakistan. So for example, one of our interviewees, Fiza Shah, who wasn't able to make it to the webinar today, but she said that she is who she is because of Pakistan. And, she grew up there. She studied there. She had a lot of community investment in her there. There's a lot of family ties there. And so when she made it big and she became successful and moved to America, she felt that it was a moral imperative to give back. And I know that that's something that's very common among our community. I know, for instance, that's how my parents feel. That's how my extended family feels. And to a large extent, that's how I feel, even having grown up in America. So I think it was really gratifying to see our survey data support that as well. And moving on to remittances. So I've studied remittances in Pakistan and also globally as part of my degree at SAIS. And I knew going into this project that, Pakistan is the 7th largest remittance receiving country in the world, that billions of dollars, I think somewhere between 3 and 7 every year and growing, goes from American pockets to Pakistan. So I knew all of that. I knew that it was a very significant a very significant international transfer. But what I didn't expect to see was that of our surveyed respondents with family in Pakistan, over half, 54% of those people regularly sent money home. And then going further, we saw some of the academic research supports that over 60% of Pakistani households rely on remittances, and that while maybe not every member of a family household receives remittances, that when remittances are received in Pakistan, it goes to one part of the community, and then as sort of a black box, it becomes spread out throughout the community. And I thought that was really cool to see. And I guess I'll end by saying this. So we found that majority of Pakistani Americans across all age groups donate to charities in Pakistan. And obviously, and this is true of all diasporas, all generations really, the older a generation is, the more established they are, the more able they are to give back at high rates. But even in the 18 to 25 generation, for example, which, you know, you would think wasn't settled enough to really start thinking about charitable behavior, we saw in our Pakistani community that a majority of 18 to 25-year-olds also gave back. And I think that was a really cool finding.
Thank you, Faraz. And we'll talk more about the generational changes as well in a few slides down. So the corruption issue came up quite a bit. This was the most interesting, most layered aspect of the findings, we thought. It emerged, unsurprisingly, as the #1 concern for Pakistani Americans, but especially among respondents between 51 to 65 years old. And then most cited corruption as a reason to not do business in Pakistan. At the same time, there was the demographic under the age of 50 were highly motivated by the market potential in Pakistan, and were more likely to say they're excited about the prospect of investing in the country. And, you know, noting again some of the values that Faraz talked about of giving back, but the growing market was something that was appealing to them. And while they also acknowledged corruption as a top concern, it wasn't a deterrent for them to get involved. And so this is really interesting because it shows a couple of things. I mean, so we can introduce some new assumptions here that we would want to test, but one is that age group of between 18 and 25, like, are they listening to what the older generation is saying about Pakistan on corruption, and like, how are those messages translating to them? What is feeding those perceptions of corruption amongst the 51 to 65-year-olds? Are those perceptions based on corruption from when they lived in Pakistan years ago, or is it more based on the reality? Because I think that there's like an experiential factor here we have to think about, right? There's probably a higher chance that if, you know, that between that 51 to 65 age group, that those folks experienced or witnessed or observed corruption firsthand, or knew of it in a more intimate way than those between 18 and 25. And so I think that there's something really interesting happening there. But the bottom line is that even though everyone cited corruption as like a reason to be concerned, it wasn't an obstacle for everyone. So that's our bottom line finding there. And you'll see that, so how we came to that finding was we asked people what they were most concerned about in Pakistan, what issues, and we asked folks to rank them in priority order. So obviously corruption came out on top. Education came in second, and that is also reflected in the giving patterns of the community towards organizations that focus on education. Those are priority organizations for the diaspora, the ones that focus on education. And then democracy, safety, like there, you know, inequality, and then individual freedom got 4%. What does that mean, people? Does that mean we don't care about individual freedom? And but part of me was thinking also like that needs to be better defined. What do individual freedoms mean? And there's, as we all know, there's a lot of social justice issues happening, everywhere around the world, but in Pakistan, they're particularly tense, and we read about them a lot, especially in the Western media. And so this audience that we're surveying is more likely to see those Western media narratives about individual freedoms and social justice in Pakistan. So I'm really interested in kind of exploring that angle and thinking about what that means. All right. Also, actually, one more thing I would like to say on just the corruption slide is that this idea that corruption persists, but then, there's still opportunity to do business on the ground. This is borne out in the data. Like we looked at several World Bank reports, which cited businesses being concerned about corruption, but going into country nonetheless. And this is all over the world. And what the data shows is actually the concerns about corruption are much higher than the occurrences of corruption, right? The corruption still occurs, but it's not at the high levels that is expected when you survey people about your concerns about it. So that's another interesting finding there. Okay, so sustained support of credible organizations. So as I mentioned, we found that there was a preference or a prioritization of giving to organizations that focus on education. Some other issues that came in a close second were disaster response, and then assistance focused on impoverished Pakistanis or those living in poverty. And then the second big defining feature of giving to organizations was that there's a preference for organizations with strong reputations and fundraising infrastructure based in the United States. So what does that mean? So strong reputations and infrastructure, like it sounds formal, but what it actually means is that there's a community member who is very closely connected with an organization in Pakistan, and they kind of take the lead as like an informal ambassador of sorts. They might not be somebody who's paid or hired to do the job of fundraising, but then it becomes much more formal, and these organizations have evolved to having offices in the United States and being registered here. And there's a preference for that, in particular amongst that demographic that, you can say second generation or Pakistani Americans born in the United States. There's a preference for that because they also don't have networks on the ground in Pakistan to that the older generation has, which would suggest that if you were an organization in Pakistan, that you would want to think very carefully about this. If that younger demographic wants to give back, but they only want to give back in this more formal way, then it would behoove these organizations to think about how they have a more engaged or permanent official presence in the United States. And another comment that we got related to giving to organizations, and I know a lot of you will relate to this, is that there could be a potential for greater impact if there was more coordination. So meaning there are a few big organizations that work in education. Bill and Citizens Foundation are two very famous, well-established ones in the United States, all over the world as well. And there are several others that are not as known, and the giving is kind of dispersed all around. And so what happens then in kind of the implementation of the giving on the ground, it's hard to actually measure the impact, right? And so you can see big numbers of diaspora giving to Pakistan, but then how does it actually impact on the ground and move the ball on kind of these bigger policy issues and goals and outcomes. And this is a tricky one too, because I think it's very easy for donors to say like, oh, why don't you all you organizations get together and coordinate and you'll have more impact in Pakistan. But it doesn't work like that, right? Organizations have their own identities, communities, visions, and like philosophies, right, for doing things and different philosophies towards education, for example. So I think this is easier said than done, but there's something really interesting there that, we could tap into, meaning, does this mean that there's more of, donor advised funds, for example, are a viable, like more viable in this community? And they do exist, but is that something that would become more preferable to those who are seeking greater impact? I mean, clearly we know that, this statistic, over 75% of Pakistani Americans give to organizations in Pakistan. The next generation is going to do even more because of the preference. So there are definitely some, there's some reasons here to think more about like how to have greater impact. Then just wanted to mention that the organizations that came up as frequent beneficiaries of the Pakistani American community were, Shokal Khanum, obviously, which does cancer treatment and welfare, and then ABI Foundation and Human Development Foundation, Bill and Citizens Foundation. Those are all of the Pakistan-based organizations that we asked them to write them in, and so they wrote them in. And then also because we did have a big sample of respondents that were connected or affiliated with UPNA. And so UPNA was another one that came up, but they're a US-based associational group. So they're a little bit of a separate category, but they do a lot of social welfare projects in Pakistan. So it is likely that people give through them as another trusted partner. Okay. So John, why don't we go to you to talk about demographics?
Sure. So I think this was one of our more interesting findings. Though first, I want to call out really quickly. I mentioned the backroom stuff about the mechanics of the survey not being that interesting. I should have taken just a second to mention potential biases. The obvious one here being that we were doing an online survey. So folks who are less comfortable in English or less comfortable using technology, we might not have, represented their views as accurately as we could have. So that is one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this data. So in terms of demographic shifts, so what I found so interesting about this was, in a way, this is deterministic. I mean, this happens to all diasporas, but the Pakistani American diaspora is sort of at an inflection point where every demographic group, in terms of age, except 18 to 25, the overwhelming majority was born in Pakistan. But in 18 to 25, it's about 50. Yeah, the number's right there. It's just over 50% were born in America. So this is the first generation of the Pakistani American diaspora with a majority American born youth. And so, it's a major inflection point in terms of, how connected does the community stay to Pakistan? Does it assimilate more into America? How does it change between, the elder group who was largely born in Pakistan and the younger group who is now at least largely and will become increasingly more so given migration trends from Pakistan to America, versus birth rates of the people already here. That's only going to become more true over time as it does with almost all diasporas. And so, this is also true. You see a split in terms of time in the US. So, the vast majority of the older generation, when you look at the waves and the peaks and troughs of Pakistani migration to America, you can see, when the older group came in, it was largely decades ago. And so you're talking about an older group that has been in America for a long time. And you can see the influences that might have in terms of some of their views. And I'll get to that more in a second. But you can also see here, one thing that's, I think, is very interesting and relevant to some of our findings is that 90% still have family in Pakistan. That's true, by the way, actually more so of the younger generation, which I thought was very interesting. The older generation, in some cases, especially with the folks who are getting up there a bit, you can imagine a situation where either most of their relatives have moved or are deceased because it's been, in many cases, decades since they've lived in Pakistan. The younger folks, even though they're majority American born, you can see they actually, by vast majorities, list they have family in Pakistan, and they feel quite connected to them in surprising ways. You can see here perceived connectivity. It was actually higher among this younger American-born generation than it is in the older generation. The way we framed this question was, do you feel as connected to Pakistan as you would like to be? And the large majority of this younger group said yes. So we found this shift where it was a little difficult to parse out, and it's something we'd like to learn, going forward. Was this because the older generation was just more content with the level of connection that it has, or is it that the younger generation just, like basically there was a little difficulty in parsing what the effect of desired connection had on perceived connection. But so in terms of beliefs about Pakistan, we found something interesting when it comes to corruption, which Shamila was talking about. So in terms of willingness to invest in Pakistan, start a business, perceived corruption and bureaucratic red tape was a big problem for the older generation when they were asked about, what are the biggest issues that are stopping you from investing, from starting a business, from, getting involved in Pakistan. It was much less so for younger folks. And, Shamila mentioned this, but part of the reason may be corruption has, if you look at IMF and World Bank indicators, gotten a lot better over time. And, as I mentioned, in many cases for these older folks, it's been decades since they lived in Pakistan. So their lived experience of Pakistan was a much more, frankly, a corrupt environment. And so in a lot of cases, you see these younger folks who don't have that experience, who know or perceive a more business friendly and more investment friendly Pakistan, express a lot more interest in doing business or investing. And I mean, on the whole, where this generation, the increasingly American-born generation, takes the diaspora is really the biggest question going forward. And we found a lot of reasons for optimism. They feel incredibly connected. They want to give back. They want to start businesses. They want to invest. The question is going to be keeping it that way. And technology is a big driver. They have way more ways to stay in touch with Pakistan now than their parents or grandparents or any past immigrant generations ever did. So the possibilities are there, but it's all going to depend on some of the policy responses, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Thank you, John. Does anyone else remember their parents screaming into the landline phone trying to talk to people in Pakistan? That's like a very vivid memory of mine growing up as a child of immigrants. And now they're just staring at their phones, looking at WhatsApp, right? Communicating regularly. So it's a lot has changed in just a short amount of time. All right, so just a final couple slides and then we're gonna open up for discussion. And also, sorry, Mom and Dad, I outed you guys for being loudmouths. So the role of governments is really important. We didn't build this report to provide recommendations for governments. One, because it's really hard, and we had a lot of foundational research we wanted to do. It's hard because governments have complicated responsibilities and duties, and especially when it comes to diaspora. But we recognize in the report that both American and Pakistani governments are very keen to engage the Pakistani American community, have done so over a period of several decades, and have evolved in their approach and continue to stay focused. So we think that's good. Based on the findings and the comments that we got in our surveys and our interviews, we came up with just these 4 areas where we feel like, more focus could be helpful. One is to engage across generations. Clearly, this community is super connected. And I would love to compare it to other communities to see, is this like a high rate of connectivity compared to others? I would guess that it is, but there are communities that have even closer and quicker access to their ancestral homes. So who knows? But it's a good question. But we definitely think that the role of governments should somehow incorporate an understanding of the generational differences and then thinking about how to engage. 2 is simply to build trust, and meaning how do governments deal with this challenge of perceptions of corruption versus what's actually happening on the ground, and how do you kind of introduce people to environments where they already have these preconceived notions that are based partly in reality, but then also have just, layers and layers of like, opinion on them. And so I think building trust is key. And it's, again, easier said than done. This is not a recommendation, it's just an observation. And the last two are just enable capital flows, which we know the Pakistani government is like well aware of the challenges. There are things being done to better facilitate this, and they're looking at it. And the last one finally is just improve the regulatory environment. So as many had said in the report, and Kulsum has a wonderful quote on this, is that really there's just like a lot of red tape, and that's what makes it hard. And you have to be kind of really in the game if you want to have to deal with a lot of that. And so it can be, I think, overwhelming. And I also sense that this didn't come up in the report, but just in my own conversations, my own work and policy, I sense that those who might be interested in doing investments or business in Pakistan are dissuaded by the regulatory angle, right? They just don't want to do it because it's like too much, or they don't know where to start, and there's not enough of just entry level facilitation. Like, this is what you need to know about doing business in Pakistan. So those are just a few short kind of comments on the role of governments. And then next steps is really meant to have us think through the future research that can be done and elaborated on. We will continue to focus on this report throughout the year. There's a lot that we want to unpack, and you'll see us kind of having separate sessions on various angles of it. So this is just the launch, but I mentioned it earlier. I'm really interested in like the connectivity issues and the platforms that get used, and then putting that into the larger global context of how technology is used and kind of the trade-offs associated with it. So misinformation is obviously one of them, but then also how do platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp shape political views and ideas of what's happening in a certain country. So corruption is something that's very much on the agenda of the current government in Pakistan, right? So how does that get translated over these platforms that people are engaging in? Corruption, the next topic that needs to be explored is corruption. So like, how do we basically encourage those in the diaspora who want to go to think about corruption and to understand it. And as we saw in our profiles that we did with Shazia Khan and Ali Said, and also the comments of Kulsum, is that there's a certain amount of just difficulty of working overseas anywhere, and red tape, or not having the relationships right away, and it's hard work, and you just kind of have to get through it, right? So oftentimes it seems that corruption is just like that. It's like the boogeyman, but it's real. But there's also a lot of other challenges that are surmountable that you just need to be aware of. I mentioned the need to kind of probe further the ethnic and religious diversity of the community. There are plenty of folks in the community who are not Muslim. And so what is their motivation for giving back? If you think about disenfranchised communities like Pakistani Christians or Pakistani Hindus, and a lot of them have left because they don't feel safe living there, or they've claimed asylum. So what about their understanding and of giving back to the country? What are their, do they give back, and how do they? And so I think there's something really interesting there to look at. We did not talk about what Pakistanis think about the diaspora in this report, or Pakistani organizations, or the government. So I think there's, that could be a whole different report on what the community's impact has been, kind of on a large scale. We didn't talk about the fact that beyond giving to organizations and beyond remittances, a lot of Pakistani American communities will sponsor schools or build NGOs, or start them in their hometowns or the villages that they come from. So on a micro level, there's a lot of giving back that doesn't get captured in research. And so gathering those views from Pakistan would be really helpful in understanding the overall impact. And then finally, government attitudes. I think some of this is documented, but what governments think about the potential is key, and trying to understand what they think are the obstacles from their side, I think is worth exploring more as well. All right, so that is the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. Hi, Shazia, welcome. Ellie, good to see you both. So, wow, that's a lot of work. John and Faraz and Ninika, amazing. And as we were preparing to do this, we all, I think we all agree, like we've been working on it for so long that there was no real, like you didn't have to prepare at the last minute if you're working on it for like 8 months, right? So I wanted to turn to Kalsoom and Shazia and Ali just to get some reactions to the report. I'm constantly inspired by the work that the three of you do to like give back, and I mean, early morning calls, late night calls. Like anytime I have to talk to somebody in Pakistan, I sort of like, I punt it as much as I can because I do not want to deal with the time difference. But you're in it completely, 100%. And so I would love your reactions to our findings, and we'll get into some of the thematic things. But let's go, Kalsoom, let's go to you first.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Shamila, and really good work on this research, guys. I am a researcher as a background, like my background is as a researcher. And so I get really geeky about this stuff too. So when you guys were telling me the findings, I had a lot of thoughts and was just brainstorming even beyond the work that we do. Do you want us to introduce ourselves as Shamila, or is that okay?
Yes, please.
So hi, everybody who's here today on the panel, in the participants. My name is Kalsoom. I am the founder of a company called Invest to Innovate, which has been working in the startup ecosystem in Pakistan for 10 years now. And I'm also a general partner in a venture capital fund called Adai Ventures, which we opened the doors to last year, and is a sister entity to the company that we've been building and the work that we've been doing for a decade now in the country. I've worked really closely with Shazia for over 10 years now, and we're working really closely on what she's building right now. So with lots to discuss. So just as a quick reactions to the research itself, and can dive into how this is relevant to our work. But first, just as reactions, I really loved just some of the findings about how Pakistanis in America are receiving their information right now. And I love the data point about WhatsApp, because from my perspective, I've been working on Pakistan. So obviously I've now directly through Invest to Innovate have been doing the work for 10 years, but I've been working on Pakistan for my entire career, so about 15 years. And it's so interesting. So much of my career has been driven by how do we tell a better narrative to Pakistanis outside of Pakistan, or anyone outside of Pakistan, so that we can actually drive beyond giving, investment, people, seeing a better version of Pakistan than what you see in the news media. And so much of that is driven because the news narrative of Pakistan is so negative. And what I found really interesting is that as WhatsApp penetration has increased, and also generally the WhatsApp connection between the US and Pakistanis in Pakistan, I feel that receiving your information directly from the source changes the narrative, even inadvertently. So if you're not only receiving your news from the news, which is obviously one version of a narrative in a very specific lens, it also kind of just creates more context and richer and more deeper qualitative insights about the country. Even if it's like, my dad sending me random memes about the vaccine in Pakistan, which my dad's in Islamabad, so I constantly get that from him. But I think what's also cool about that is that it means that also I work in the startup space. The startup space has like dramatically accelerated over, generally it's been going on for 10 years, but in the last 2 years, really, we've seen so many stories come out in the market. And what I see so often on WhatsApp is all of those things forwarded in a much higher frequency. And I was just listening to a Clubhouse chat the other day about the idea that the network effect is so much faster right now in the information age that we're living in. So people are receiving information a lot faster and are getting it a lot more frequently. And the last two comments that I'll make on giving, because obviously from the diaspora perspective, Most of the money that has been going back to Pakistan is either remittance or we're seeing more charitable giving. Obviously, with what we all work on is much more on capital that's going back, and investment capital specifically, which is a different, more bigger topic to discuss. But one thing that I find interesting about here in giving is that it's so deeply social in nature. So a lot of people go to galas that TCF or Shaukat Khanum is doing. And so it's seen as like a very community driven thing, which obviously adds to the credibility of it. And I think given that Pakistan is such a relational place, that checks out to me. The last thing I'll say about corruption is that this checks out in Pakistan too on the surveys that we do. And we actually have an entire research arm at our work at Invest to Innovate. And so as I just mentioned, I'm a researcher by background. And so for us, we've done research on entrepreneurs in the country, not just, from you guys have covered Pakistanis looking at Pakistan and potentially wanting to go back. Pakistanis in the country also don't see corruption. And these are young entrepreneurs that we're surveying, don't see corruption as big of a barrier as, say, the regulatory environment or the taxation space, right? And so it's also a perception issue because corruption is around the world. Corruption is a very big issue here too. It's just not as open, right? So when we talk about petty corruption, that's something that's a much more visible thing. So my observations, operating in emerging markets is that corruption, because it's petty and it's something that's a lot more seen, maybe something that people tend to have like maybe a more visceral reaction to. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of entrepreneurs, you don't have to participate in corruption. I think you see it as like you're either an active participant in it, in petty corruption, or you're not, right? A lot of entrepreneurs, even in other markets, people that I've met in Nigeria and in other parts of the world have actually called it transactional fees of doing business. This is the art of doing business in these countries, and doesn't mean you participate in it, but it's also how we perceive and view corruption. So those are some of my initial takeaways, but excited to dig in more and would love to hear what Shazia and Ali have to say too.
Thank you, Kulsum. Shazia, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just gonna try to pick it up where Kulsum left off. First of all, really awesome, really great job. I think this report is extremely useful, and I'm, just so excited to have it and to be able to use it as a resource. So I'm gonna just start with corruption.
Can you introduce yourself really quick? I want everyone to know, all the great work you do.
My name is Shazia Khan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Eco Energy. Eco Energy is a solar company. We are accelerating the adoption of solar in emerging markets through a digital platform and access to finance. And as Kulsum said, she and I have been working closely together for the past decade when nobody even thought that anybody would ever want to have a startup in Pakistan, right? And now there's so many startups blossoming day after day, month after month. And so the thing that I would say about corruption is that it does exist, and it's very frustrating. Like anytime you want to, anytime we submit an application, there's a participation fee, or there's you have to pay something just to be considered. And we have a strict no corruption policy. So we push back as much as we can without offending, or more likely, we have to figure out ways around it. We circumvent it. So for instance, the World Bank is not immune to this. We're getting ready to do a big project with them. And I tried to complain about the participation fee that we're being charged, which I felt like was, we're being hijacked to do something, a rural electrification scheme to help poor people, and the government wants a cut. And they were like, yeah, that's really high. Normally they don't want 10%. Normally they ask for 8%. I'm like, you know about this? What the hell? So it's usually something like that. But anyway, if you hold out for long enough and they need you, then they usually will come back around, which is what happened. Or we said, well, we cannot do that. We don't have a way to show it from an accounting perspective. We have to be very transparent in our accounting, for instance, right? So there's no way that we can pay that fee. Then there's always a way to circumvent it. So now we're working with other partners down the line. And if they want to pay it, or they have a fixer or whatever, I can't do anything about that, but I'm not going to pay it. So there's plenty of ways around it. Corruption has always been a problem everywhere, but you just have to stick to a no corruption policy, and then just, I don't know, find like other workarounds. But there's such a, I'm so sorry. My dogs are so bad. Hey, be quiet.
That's okay. I talk like that to my kids on every webinar, by the way.
I think too that the nature of business has changed generally. Maybe when this older generation that was surveyed was coming or trying to do business or just trying to maintain a business, they had to constantly, pay bribes. Maybe some of these really big companies, they have a fixer in place who has to deal with bribes. But as you have smaller and smaller startups, and we have more and more ways to directly access customers, we don't always have, like, we very rarely even have to go to the government. And unless we're doing a project with the government, which we increasingly tend not to want to do just because we don't want to get involved in that, like, we have very little interaction with the government except for maybe once a year or once every couple of years when we have something to do with, like, we want to be able to go directly to the consumers. There's a huge market of people that need to be serviced. And so there's ways now to directly access them, whereas maybe there wasn't before. So like, businesses can be smaller and can be more, can reach customers in a different way now than maybe was true 40 years ago or 30 years ago. Okay, so that's all I want to say about that. Then what I really liked is the work that you guys did on the remittance stuff. I'm really interested in digging in further. You're saying that $7 billion a year, I think, is coming from the US and going to Pakistan. I find that really interesting because are there other ways that that money can go back? Is it just cash? Is it can it be invested in something else, like a solar energy saving, like a solar energy system that can generate savings for your family, or that can reduce their electricity bill? Obviously, I'm saying that that's quite self-serving, but there's many different applications to this. I just don't know what they are. But I'm very, very excited to see this data coming out, and if there's a way for us to figure out other ways to apply it. That's really exciting to me.
On the remittances, Faraz, if you want to respond, I just wanted to add on that. That was a really hard section to work on because it's actually not clear, like it's not like well known or well documented, like how many remittances or how much actually goes to Pakistan, like from the United States or any other country for that matter. Pakistani Americans are actually like a very small component of the global diaspora that gives back.
Right? Billion, right? It's
most of it is coming from the Gulf. But I want Faraz to talk about this. This was all his research. But Faraz, I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of the remittances being redirected in ways that Shazia talked about?
Money saving investments.
Right. No, I think a lot of people would be very interested in money saving investments. So Shazia, that's a great idea. But I think Shamila's right in that, first of all, officially, like at the international level, the World Bank calculates remittances with like balance of payments calculations and different stuff like that. So you're absolutely right. Like when you said, is it all in cash? Well, the short answer is no, but like it could be the same amount of cash that isn't even counted is going every year from America or wherever, the GCC, like Shamila said. And it also could be that ever since, people, especially in Corona times, when people can't fly back, can't, take money back and have like a suitcase full of cash to give out to their relatives, that there have been increasing the formalization of remittances through other channels like banks. And the Pakistani government also passed like a July 2020 tax cut to allow people to write off the amount of remittances that they got in certain accounts. So there's been a lot of movement on formalization, and it's also always hard to track even in a non-coronavirus, lifestyle. So yes.
Yeah, can I ask you one last question, Faraz? So the State Bank of Pakistan has put out this survey right now. Are you guys all on that? They put together a committee and they sent us something and said, please send this out to everybody that you know. And we're trying to get all this more detailed remittance information so that we can use it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Did you?
I saw it. Yeah, I saw it.
Coordinate with them at all? Is that useful, valuable? Are you going to work with them?
We haven't coordinated with them, but we are going to have a webinar on this topic with state bank speakers. We're working on that, so we'll let everyone know because they are keen to engage, and they've come to our past webinars and have been really helpful. So. So let's, Ali, I want to hear from you. I want you to tell everyone about your work, and would love to hear your reaction to the report.
Yeah, first and foremost, I'd like to thank everybody on the call that put the report together. I think this is amazing work, and it was much needed. There wasn't any formal documentation happening in this process. I'm surprised that I actually made it into the report. I wasn't expecting that to happen. Like there's a section about me, so I was like, well,
2 pages.
I still get really weirded out when I get put in things. I'm not used to that. But I think the good part of the report. I would say I think the exciting part of the report, but a slightly sad part of the report, is it confirmed a lot of the ideas that I kind of already had and assumptions that we had about how people were doing things, which is good and sad, and I think in the same way. So I have a couple of different comments on a couple of the key points. So I think the corruption aspect definitely requires more investigation, because that wasn't a surprise to me. But I think many times corruption is more of a key word on like the nature of doing business in Pakistan than the actual amount of corruption that actually happens. There's some, I wouldn't say systemic problems necessarily. There's a way to doing things that part of that is cultural. Pakistan, part of that is because of the lack of government facilities available to do that. So I really would like to ask, dig it deeper to that. I don't really think that corruption has decreased or increased. I think it's probably at the same level that it has always been at. And I've had the privilege of my father being a businessman before I was. And, he was doing startups in the 70s and 80s. And, he started like 5 or 6 different businesses. And he dealt with different sorts of what we will call corruption. But, your Kulsoom said transactional fees. My dad had what they call a chai pani section on the account books, right? Someone came and they had to do some tea and water. That's how the accountant did it. So, but the other thing I'm interested in is kind of the professions and the reason why people move here, because I think a lot of people that moved here probably moved here for education and went into professional services and then went into business, and they never really had an actual insight to the business culture in Pakistan. That really isn't the focus of a Pakistani household, right? When you're there, you're a doctor, you're an engineer, some sort of professional, and maybe somewhere down the line, you want to become a businessman. In my house, because my dad was a businessman, he always stressed that we needed to be. So I'm wondering how much proximity these people that are talking about corruption actually ever had to the business side and to the actual corruption that they're kind of seeing. The other thing that I find interesting is like I find the remittance number encouraging, but also kind of worrying at the same time. I find it encouraging that a lot of Pakistanis are sending a lot of money back, but I think there's further investigation that needs to be done on what's happening there. I believe right now, like I send money for my company back to Pakistan, and I think I'll do my intro at the end because I skipped that. But I don't know if that number is included in the remittance number. Right? Because that is a bank-to-bank transfer. Is it included? Is it not included? I'm trying to figure that out. And I think more of the remittance is going to get tracked more because Pakistan has introduced much stricter banking controls now. Mm-hmm. So a lot of money coming in and out really does have to be, especially money coming in and money leaving. Inside the country is still ambiguous, but at least money coming in and going out there's a lot more tracking on it. So I think some of that will come up. But the reason it's worrying is because if it's mostly just people, living abroad and then sending money back to their families because, their families, can't afford to live in Pakistan without getting money from abroad. That's one worrying factor. And the second worrying factor is obviously that's brain drain. Ideally, those people would live and stay in Pakistan. But I think it's encouraging that people are still giving back. The other thing I think from the hardness to do business, and I think this points back to the corruption aspect of it and the government. So the problem with the government, I don't think that they're trying to be necessarily a specific blocker, but the government institutions just aren't very strong, and the processes just don't have much detail. So, for example, like there really isn't an official way for me to kind of run a background check on someone in Pakistan, right? I can't go ask someone and kind of get a history of their employment report. So when I go hire people in Pakistan, like I actually get letters of employment from their previous employers, and then we contact them, and it's a referral sort of network. And again, I have the privilege of being connected with some very good, amazing business people in Pakistan, just because of the privilege of the class that I come from. My dad was a businessman. He was well connected. And I don't know how many of the people that moved here really have that sort of connection to really even explore, how do you go about doing business in Pakistan and other things like that, and really have that network. And in Pakistan, one, because the institution doesn't exist. And I think the other thing is just, it's an old centric culture. America was founded on many new principles. I think Pakistan is very similar to Europe in that sense. Class really matters. Who you know really matters. What you look, what you wear, how you present yourself really matters. And you need to know and even I stumble, and my partner does most of it. You need to know what to say and how to say it in what circles. And, you might say something and someone just gets offended, and you find out like 2 months later that you've been getting blocked because you went to someone's wedding and you said something. And then that person just got pissed off, and now he's blocking you forever. So that happens here too, but it's different over there. And yeah, so those are kind of my general kind of overall thoughts. Specifically on charity, I think this was to Dr. Qureshi, we were talking about yesterday as well, is I would really like to understand how many people are kind of doing their own projects and how many things are actually institutionalized, because again, Pakistanis are really great at just finding causes to give money to, or setting up or doing things. But I think we struggle with that here, and maybe it's more of a general, Muslim, not Muslim, but that regional thing as well, because there's other factors that play into it. The Britishers came in and they kind of destroyed institutions that were there for thousands of years and wiped out a lot of things. But what I find that our community really struggles with is not only setting up institutions there, and part of the reason why I'm part of APF is having institutions here that we can all be part of and work together in. There's a very single-minded thing, I'm going to go build a mosque, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, rather than saying, let's build an organization that's going to do all of these things that can outlive us and hopefully benefit the next generation as well.
Yeah, and I on that point, Ali, I think one of the reasons people probably do their own projects is because of that fear of corruption, like not knowing what will happen outside of your immediate network, right? And that has essentially disabled the development of institutions in the diaspora. And it's hard, it's really hard when you're working, as you mentioned, like in a society that is based on class and education and all of these factors in very strong ways. I like that you made this comment about relationships and who you know and your own kind of privilege, because we've heard this is just anecdotally, we didn't do the research on this, but we have a fellows program, a Pakistan fellows program. We send people to work in development NGOs in Pakistan in the summer. Most of them are Pakistani Americans. And the reason they go, there's two reasons. One is they want a career in international development. The second reason is that they don't know Pakistanis or Pakistan outside of their family compounds or their family villages or environments. And they don't have an opportunity to explore. When you go, you spend 2 weeks like going to everyone's house, giving them gifts, and then you're done, So you need more time, and you don't have that. And so what our read of that as APF is that if there's an institution like APF and others that create platforms and mechanisms to facilitate that exchange, so I could that would help, right? So I can imagine, now that we've done this report, we know what people don't know and what they're interested in. Like, we could build a series of seminars on like, what does it actually mean to do business in Pakistan? Like, let's do a nuts and bolts, right? And so I think some of the foundational work is lacking, and people jump over what's lacking and they want to act. And so it's like, well, I might as well build my own school, Shazia, you look like you want to say something.
Actually, I was going to say something. I want to make sure that I think that Ali's experience can probably be very true. Obviously it is, it's his experience, but I am an American. I was born and raised here. I have some extended family that I don't know that well in Pakistan, but I don't have any, I don't want people in this new generation to feel like if they have this burning desire and they have a great idea and they want to do something in Pakistan, that they can't if they don't have the right connections or they're not born into privilege. I have not found that to be the case at all. My dad came here in 1968 to the US. He's not that educated. He is an entrepreneur. He worked very hard. He's quite successful, but he came from nothing here. He doesn't have any connections. Pakistan. There was one time, one person asked me about 14 years ago, who is your father? When I was just starting to look at eco energy. Since that one old guy, nobody has ever asked me again.
That's so true.
That's one thing that I just want to say. It has not, nobody gives two shits or it's certainly not stopped me in my work that my dad's not some very rich, well-known businessman in Pakistan, because he's not, He's a rich businessman here because he works really hard. Nobody knows who he is over there. So I just want to know, that's one thing. The second thing is that you could look into a little bit more is gender. People always assume that I have a lot of issues working in Pakistan as a female CEO and a female founder. And Kulsoom, you might have something to say about this too, but I have never had an issue with any one member of my team, and to my knowledge, with any of our customers. In fact, now we're known as a couple of times my field staff have told me that people know that in the beginning, I think they thought I was a secretary tagging along on a field visit, but now they're like, oh, you're the company with the lady CEO. So, and I'm not trying to, I wasn't trying.
No. I take your approach is completely valid. And I mean, we've been trying to grow the female presence in our company as well, definitely. And I think there are very, very strong female leaders in Pakistan. I think Pakistan is
about the privilege. I wasn't trying to take a dig at you.
No. I'm not taking a dig at it either. The thing that I wanted to clarify is I didn't mean it specifically in the sense that you can't not go do business or have a good experience. Yeah. I meant it in terms of the corruption aspect and why people feel that, because if they had those privileged connections, then you get a lot more information into the inner workings. And it's just like being over here. I can make a call and get to the government minister that I need to, and he can tell me, oh, you need to do this, this, and this, which is, a different lag. And interestingly enough, when one of the things I forgot to comment on is it's very interesting that people went back to Pakistan because of family. But interestingly enough, I didn't go back to Pakistan because of family, because most of my immediate family actually came back, is in America, that I'm super connected to. And I didn't really go back to do business with my family at all. I actually went back on a State Department grant to Pakistan. After I went once, after I came to America, I went once in 8 years. And the next time I went was 7 years later. And when I went there, sorry?
What was the grant for?
So the city of Austin and the province of Punjab got together a program to. Yeah, Alicia Dean. Yeah. Yep. So and then so I went through that, and with that way, actually, I was able to build a professional network in Pakistan. And even when I do business back there right now, I actually don't do business with any family, and we actually have a strict protocol on being a little bit careful on that, because we want to maintain.
And now there's LinkedIn. So
can I make a quick comment? Because I actually agree with both what just to be the diplomat in the middle, but actually I see what both of them are saying, right? And actually I kind of find it funny and interesting that all three of us are the kids of entrepreneurs, because that's very atypical for Pakistani kids. So maybe that says something about all of us deciding to be entrepreneurs ourselves. Maybe it was through osmosis. So to Shazia's point and to Ali's point, actually, I totally agree, because the startup ecosystem in Pakistan is something that has been almost created in a way as an outlier to what has happened in traditional Pakistani society. It doesn't operate the way we typically do, right? It is very relational still. If you want to get things done, it's typically by who you know, but the who you know aren't necessarily the elite of the elite, right? Because those are generally the incumbents that are operating these family businesses and things like that, right? That's not how things get done. And interestingly, to Shazia's point, no one's ever asked me who my dad is. And the funniest thing recently is people telling my dad, oh, I know who your daughter is.
Exactly.
Which is really funny, because my dad is very much I was an entrepreneur way before you. The second thing that I'll say, though, to Ali's point earlier, is that there is a lot of unconscious bias that is classist still, though. As we say that, one thing that I've noticed is that me having an American accent affords me different access in rooms or different level of respect. A white man would get the most amount of respect in that room. We have a post-colonial hangover that is very real. Someone who has been educated purely in Pakistan that might speak English better than their Urdu is actually, and this is so terrible, and it's something that I really wish I really want us to work more against, is often, sometimes without meaning to, there's a bias against them in terms of even when they're pitching, when I listen to investors and who they respond to the most, right? So that unconscious bias is deeply ingrained in class, in education, in all of those things. And so I do think that that is a reality as well.
And I have a white co-founder.
You do.
There.
Who's
yeah, I wanted you to say that. So he's been there for how long now?
12 years.
Yeah, been in Pakistan.
Kulthum introduced us.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Well, Shazia, I love having you on the panel because I can always count on you to drop an S-bomb here and there. So I love that.
That's why we love Shazia.
Keeping it real. I just had a couple of comments, like scattered comments, actually. You talked about the white man and showing up and speaking English. Sure, there's like this certain amount of privilege, but also it's probably hard if you're a non-Pakistani American or non-Pakistani going to Pakistan and do business, right? I mean, there's got to be some like really basic challenges, unless you're coming from like a big corporation and you have access, that kind of thing. But like, you all know better than me, but like, is the promise of like, investing in startups in Pakistan something that diaspora are they getting the message?
Yeah.
Kulthum made them.
Yeah, she made them, exactly.
Yeah, I would say there's some people that are doing some really hard work in Pakistan to attract those investors, Kulthum being one of them, and there's a couple other people that are doing that as well, and they're doing that. I think the really interesting thing, and I think this is perfectly fine, but it's a Pakistani will give another Pakistani a much harder time. I think that's just the nature of how we are. And when you're doing business, there's more negotiation. There's more cutting down the price. There's more other things that you do. Then if an outsider comes and do it, I try to do it, at least try to do it in reverse. It's like, hey, I would rather give more money to a Pakistani, help them, do more. So there is this culture of like, we like to like work against each other sometimes. I think Pakistan is becoming the center. So very interestingly, and I'll mention my company background here as well. So I run a company where we help connect US technology startups with engineering talent in Pakistan. And the way that we kind of do it differently, we're doing direct placements in. So it's not meant to be like, oh, there's a PM and we're taking projects. We're trying to build teams for people. And those teams really don't matter where they are right now. So the opportunity is that they can get really good talent that is at a little bit more affordable price in the US, and also access to talent. US is becoming harder and harder to secure the people that you need. And for the US engineers, for the Pakistani engineers, it's the opportunity to have a well-paid salary, stable job position, but also working directly with people to upskill themselves. And we just became a white, so I don't know if people are familiar with what a PEO is. It's like an Insperity or an ADP. And we just became a white label partner for one of them to just provide payroll service and everything. And they were saying that for outsourcing and people finding engineers, Pakistan actually is coming up as the number one or number two Google search. So Pakistan is definitely on the map in terms of tech. The technology scene and some of the successes are actually now uplifting, and there's lots of corporations. I can even say we've talked to some Fortune 100 companies in America that are looking at large presence or increasing their presence that already is. So I think Pakistan is going to change a lot in the next probably 2 to 5 years. We're going to see a lot of growth. I kind of see us where maybe Eastern Europe was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot of startup activity, lots of people becoming engineers. The local scene is quite not there to kind of employ all these people just yet. I think it's getting there. I think probably in the next 5-6 years, we'll get such a robust local scene that a lot of these engineers will actually start going. And I think then you'll see a really big uptick in entrepreneurship, even more than it is right now. But Pakistan, from what we've seen, what we've encountered with clients that I talk to and other people, it's definitely on the map for people. and very significant people. It's not just, people are discovering it and they want to go there and they want to do business there and find people there.
And even in informal networks like Upwork is full of Pakistani talent. Everything from marketing, engineers.
Yeah, aren't we like one of the top 4 countries in the world on freelancers right now?
Yes.
So big deal. I think we're also cheaper talent than finding it elsewhere. So
yeah, that makes. I wanted to just I wanted to make this distinction. Is observing our conversation. I mean, there's corruption. We're talking about corruption and also interest in access to the market and stuff in terms of the startup space and business. But then there's also the concerns about corruption and getting involved when it comes to charity and organizations, right? So there, and then also just remittances. So there's like all these different ways of giving. And I think that outside of like the startup space on being able to trust charities in Pakistan is still a very big issue, even though like our data showed that a lot of Pakistani Americans will give to organizations, but they're only giving to like the same 5 organizations, right? And so there's got to be a better way to spread that wealth, A, but B, this touches upon something Ali said about the state and the government. I'm worried about this data too, because if all these remittances are going to Pakistan and then the state is collecting them, which they should, but it's being kind of interpreted as like this is another source of revenue that helps stabilize the country. And I feel like it really, it kind of takes the responsibility off of the state to a certain extent that, it's a good thing that our remittances are going, but at the same time, like what are they being used for? And these, and if you have families, say, who need it just to survive and they're living in villages or small towns, and they're doing relatively well because they're getting however many hundreds of dollars a month from, brother, sister in the US, they're not going to show up in the statistics in a realistic way. I'm curious about that, right? Because the brain drain thing is important, but it's also like we're kind of skewing the local dynamics.
Well, it's like, hey, we're like 8% of your GDP. Well, what happens if we're just not there one day, or if all these people who are contributing $27 billion decide they want to spend their money on Amazon?
Right. But at some point, people are not going to be, unless you have a steady flow of migration coming and people who continue to have family to give back to, that remittances, that whole remittances space becomes kind of, it's very gray, because then it stops, the loop stops. So it's like, do you really have like 20, one more generation to go? Like, and we tried to do this, but it was a little out of our scope, but we looked at kind of migration patterns and the numbers of Pakistanis coming and how it's linked to US legislation, for example, right? So, and how you control it, like how the host country will control the migration, and that will impact remittances. So
that's a good point, Shamila.
I'm a little concerned, but then when we do the report,
so it's the same thing. That's why they're looking into it. They're like, hey, just tell me real quick, answer this survey. Why are you sending it? Who are you sending it to again? What did you do? Western Union? Let me just write that down.
Tell me that number.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. No, but just to like kind of wrap it all up, put it all together, because we have a few more minutes left. But we all have our own. We all came to this country. If you're coming from Pakistan, we came at different periods. Like I came in 1980. I was born in Pakistan. I was 2, right? I do have family in Pakistan, but I also have family all over the world, right? There's nobody I would like. I'm not personally connected, right? I mean, we see each other, we talk to each other every once in a while, but it's not like I would not send money back, right? But my parents do, for example. But I'm still connected. Like my work is related to Pakistan. Like I will travel there. I will take my kids there. But as my family grows, like I'm going to be connected in a much more formal way, potentially, because I don't have people I'm personally like connected to living in the country. And so unless you have this steady flow of people, that connectivity is going to become informal. It could change. And like you said, I think the government realizes that. And that's where these formal structures become really important, right? So I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of work we could elaborate on here. Like we could definitely do more on the remittances angle. I think there's good work to be done there. I also think we should just, we could even just focus on like, what does it mean to do business in Pakistan, and sharing kind of your experiences and to demystify it a little bit. I want to go to John and Faraz just for some closing comments. Like what was, tell us about kind of what surprised you about the findings. We've been working on this for a long time, and Faraz, as you mentioned, you've worked on some of the issues before, but what was surprising or most interesting in doing this project?
Faraz, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, beyond all the remittance craziness, which excellent questions, everybody. I'm happy to talk about them after one-on-one, whatever. But so for me, I think I started getting more involved in Pakistan stuff in the last couple of years. You know, I had a fellowship, a State Department grant actually, like Ali, to go to India and learn Urdu, and then I reconnected kind of with my roots. I was personally, because that's been very gratifying, right? That has been excellent, and you know, culminated in obviously writing this report with Shamaila, and that's been very, very personally and professionally satisfying. I was very floored by the 18 to 25 survey data, because you know, this is kind of like a sort of normal story, I think, at least for my generation, is, you know, you grow up and you grow up like, you know, age 0 to 10, you're very connected to your culture, you don't have any options. You know, like you take your Sabzi Mandi to school, you get made fun of at age 10, and then you're like, I'm not Pakistani anymore, that's it, you know, right? And so you disconnect. And for me, that lasted through college. So I thought it was very gratifying to see that, you know, people my age, 18 to 25, either they, you know, didn't get made fun of at age 10 and never disconnected, or they've had the same, you know, situation that I had and they reconnected and they feel like they're as connected as they want. And obviously that, with the caveat, like John said, that maybe the survey results are biased because the people that are going to fill out the survey are probably already predisposed to being more connected. But still, just even with whatever results, take them as with a grain of salt, it was really cool to see, I think.
Awesome. John, our honorary Pakistani American.
Yeah. So actually, that's sort of what was interesting to me most of all was, you might all be shocked to learn this, but I myself am not Pakistani American. But the countries my family did come from, we have no connection to at all, just absolutely none. And no one my age that I know from, you know, Eastern, from like Poland, Latvia, whatever, I've never been to those places. You know, it's like it's a complete break in terms of my family and almost everyone I'm aware of from that part of the world. It's like it died generations ago. And so to see that, you know, the people my age of Pakistani American heritage feel so connected, and you know, 90% still have family, and you know, the migration patterns were a bit different, but still it's really interesting, and I think it gives folks, you know, in that situation a much greater chance, if they want to keep connected, you know, permanently, and you know, then their children might continue the same thing. Whereas, you know, for most American diasporas, you know, including the places my own family is from, that just is a totally different situation. So it'll be really interesting to see how it evolves.
Thank you. Well, we're at, Shazia, did you want to say something?
No.
Oh,
it's just easily excitable.
Yeah. So, well, I'm so proud of the work that John and Faraz and our other team members have done. You've made a big difference for the community, and there's going to be so much more to do. So you're not off the hook. As you know, with APF, we'll continue to volunteer, tell you to do things and be involved. So thank you. And thank you to our guests. Please share the report. Stay tuned for other conversations that will build upon these themes. So thanks, Ali, Shazia, Kulsum. It was good to see you all. Stay safe, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Khodafis.